In this presentation, our group will discuss the subject of epigenetics, its definition and current relevant information, how it relates to the field of counseling, its relevance to minority populations, and how it can be addressed by mental health counselors. Epigenetics is described as heritable changes in DNA function caused by activation and deactivation of genes without any change in DNA sequence. This proposes that genes can undergo epigenetic change that does not change the strand of DNA itself, but rather its structure by turning on or off certain sequences. Called methylation, this process can then directly affect future cognitive processes as well as behavior. Epigenetic marks have been observed in genes that may impact stress response, emotional regulation, disease susceptibility, and mental disorders. There is a link between socioeconomic status and the epigenetic process of methylation. For decades, researchers have questioned why it seems to be so difficult for families to break the cycle of poverty and why it seems to be an intergenerational trend. At times, it has even been termed a culture of poverty, implying that this is something one is born into and that it is simply just a way of life. As the structure and the purpose of DNA has been studied in more recent years, it has been discovered that there are heritable changes in DNA structure that can actually partially account for that trend of poverty. When methylation occurs, portions of the DNA sequence are silenced or turned off, and when reproduction occurs, that gene is then passed on to the child. When combined with the effects of one's socioeconomic status, the process of methylation affects genes related to nervous system function. This can then lead to external stressors that elicit maladaptive changes to the central nervous system. Those who are impoverished tend to experience poorer nutrition and experience more stress-related diseases. These factors alone can cause methylation to occur. It is also known that fetal exposure to maternal distress is correlated with compromised neurodevelopment. When viewed in light of the circumstances that typically are associated with living an impoverished life, it is not surprising to learn that fetal development is directly affected. Interestingly, epigenetic effects do not always have negative consequences. In one study, it was found that pregnant mothers from an impoverished neighborhood underwent what is called hypermethylation in specific genes. This effect is predicted to actually increase the resilience of the unborn child, so that in the future, he or she will be more able to handle similar difficult situations as the mother. Epigenetic changes can occur at any point in one's life. However, the changes are most influential when they occur in utero. This is due to the fact that the younger one is when these changes occur, the earlier in the developmental process one is, and therefore, changes that are made to the DNA sequence will have a greater biological effect overall. Changes caused by methylation are not immutable, meaning that they are not permanent. Given the right circumstances or the proper interventions, these changes can be reversed. Due to the biological processes involved, epigenetics is typically viewed from the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate. However, nurture plays a vital role when interventions are employed in order to bring about a reversal of the methylated DNA sequences.
When thinking about epigenetics in terms of psychology, behavior, and counseling, it's important to remember that this is a new area of study and much still needs to be learned. The first international scientific conference on epigenetics was held in 2010 by the New York Academy of Sciences, which adopted the term behavioral epigenetics and its definition as the application of the principles of epigenetics to the study of the physiological, genetic, environmental, and developmental mechanisms of behavior. While there have been many studies over the years on epigenetics, we're only just beginning to answer the question of how genetic expression affects behavior. So instead of the traditional question of nature versus nurture and their respective influences on development, epigenetics tries to explain how nurture shapes nature. It attempts to answer the question, how do life experiences result in lasting changes in body function and behavior across generations? Instead of blaming genetics for all mental disorders, it is becoming evident that there is a constant interaction of biology and environment. Some of the more interesting research suggests that the effects of parental experiences can persist up to 3 and 4 generations. The implications of this for the counselor are many. In addition to personal experiences, the effect of cultural trauma like war, famine, slavery, or poverty can be long-lasting and affect a whole people group. The foundation of behavior is learning and memory. Epigenetic modifications to genes have been demonstrated to have an effect on learning and memory function. In effect, some events or environmental factors can actually turn on and off certain genes. And understanding the ways in which some of these environmental factors have long-lasting biological effects on the nervous system is a challenge for mental health professionals. Next slide. One theory on overcoming some of these challenges builds on the work of Kurt Lewin, who surmised that we're taught by our culture how to think and to act. So significant individual change might be influenced by significant cultural change. Commenting on this, Dr. Larry Brentro says, behavior can only be understood as we examine the individual embedded within relationships with significant others in the social ecology of family, school, peer group, and community. In practical application, then, we should consider that being vulnerable to mental disorders might be the result of exposure to certain conditions during development instead of a predetermined genetic disposition. This means that there may be potential for many effective treatments that do not resort to medications, but instead focus on positive reinforcement and relationship building. For example, mentoring programs might be an effective method to help youth meet their unmet need for attachment. A study on the island of Kauai tracked 698 children born in 1955 for the duration of 50 years in an attempt to determine the long-term effects of early child-rearing conditions on a person's cognitive and social development later in life. And there was a significant benefit found for children in their ability to overcome adversity if they had at least one person who accepted them unconditionally. It's clear that we're only beginning to understand the importance of early attachment and how parenting affects brain development. But this new study of epigenetics is promising to help us understand how environment and experience work together to influence the expression of genes. With this new appreciation for the way in which experience and environment may affect us all the way down to the molecular level, we must ask some old questions in a new light. For example, why are some parents more affected by challenging children than others? Why are some children more resilient than others? Are there some historical environmental factors to consider when treating current disorders in adults? Do cultural norms have a bigger impact on parenting styles and stressful development than previously thought? Could it be possible through epigenetic reprogramming of cells to potentially fix or prevent things like addiction, anxiety, and depression? If nothing else, this new field of study can broaden the frame of reference for the counselor and encourage them to approach clients as a whole, looking at their entire existence to find a more personalized course of treatment. While the study of epigenetic processes in the brain is still in its early stages, it does promise to improve our understanding of neuroplasticity and some psychiatric disorders, and it might lead to the development of some new types of treatments. Next slide.
I will be focusing my attention on the negative health effects on minority populations resulting in changes to gene expression through a lifetime of negative exposure. The vast majority of current research on intergenerational trauma is focused on social risk factors such as income, education, and other risks, with little attention paid to race and ethnicity. Research, however, indicates there are observable biological changes that occur as a result of societal factors. Allostatic load, as defined by Webster, is a cumulative adverse effect on the body after a period of repeated stressors. There is a significant impact on racial and minority groups since they are disproportionately represented in the poor or lower class and undergo additional stressors due to their socioeconomic status. Environmental factors such as exposure to toxic chemicals and harmful living conditions can have a profound effect on the health of minority populations. The ability of minority groups to remove themselves from these stressful situations is oftentimes hindered, which has a direct negative effect on their health and the health of their offspring. For example, the stress in minority populations can have a varying effect on a person's health, which can result in long-term issues that can be passed from generation to generation. Hypertension is a good example of an intergenerational health issue in an African American population. A prolonged response to stress from a lifetime of struggling can lead to elevated blood pressure. This can be passed down from generation to generation, in addition to such conditions as obesity, alcohol consumption, and fatty food consumption. When a mother or father's self-care is lacking by such things as smoking, drinking, unhealthy eating, or drug use, research indicated that DNA methylation can occur. Repeated exposure to stressors can impact the health outcomes of current and future generations. Next slide. According to research, there is some evidence that epigenetic regulators can be altered by exposure to social, psychological, physical, and environmental factors beginning in utero. These changes to the epigenetic regulators occur over a lifetime of stressors that disproportionately affect minority populations. Researchers are beginning to focus their attention on minority populations since they tend to be at risk for exposure to poor social circumstances as well as environmental exposure. Recent studies indicate that genetic factors may put specific minority groups at greater risk for certain health outcomes and explain disparities among and between different groups. Exposure to different environmental or social factors at different parts of a developing person's life can affect future development and health. For example, living next to a chemical plant as a child can negatively affect the development of the child, resulting in internal changes, resulting in cancer or other chronic diseases. Additionally, being exposed to constant violence and having access to poor or no healthcare can negatively affect a child's development physically, emotionally, and academically. According to the developmental origins of health and disease model, early life experiences shape adult health through epigenetic modifications that can alter the long-term risk of disease. It is important to develop strategies to help minority populations build up their resilience to these negative societal factors to ensure adequate health. Early evidence suggests that their ability to overcome adversity can have a positive effect on their mental health. Targeting things that cause stress in minority communities should be a focus of mental health and medical professionals. A deeper understanding of epigenetics and further study specifically directed towards minority populations is required to aid in developing targeted approaches to resolving the long-term health effects of repeated stressors in minority communities. Further studies should include research into the negative effects of repeated discrimination, poor educational and economic opportunities, and availability of family and community resources. A large number of studies were also found which disavowed the validity of the effects of epigenetics in minority communities. These studies tended to take a pessimistic view on the research presented and use it as a distraction from the greater good. It is important to evaluate all factors together in developing an approach to build up the resilience of struggling segments of the population. Taking a more holistic worldview of the problems minorities families experience to include the evidence obtained through epigenetic studies can go a long way in solving an issue that has plagued our nation and other nations for generations. Next slide.
Epigenetics has been addressed by mental health professionals in many different ways. For example, Heighem explains in his article how an updated understanding of the evolutionary theory and epigenetics can put a different perspective on clients' here and now distress. He argues that a shift toward seeking natural explanations for mental health conditions brings with it the suggestion of a more natural intervention, which are seen as offering the most long-term benefit to clients. And these natural interventions would include mindfulness and mindful self-compassion, exercise, meaningful activity, such as volunteering in the community, physical self-care, and developing self-awareness. Furthermore, Ivy and Zachalet say to focus on positive strengths and resources for resilience in clients, their families, and their culture, primarily the resilience that could help overcome the epigenetic issues they've been facing. Our biggest role as counselors is to offer an explanation for clients' distress and suffering that helps to take away the self-blame and confusion that frequently accompanies this distress. Next slide, please. To further Haigham's treatment strategies, Kiyimba mentions relaxation techniques in their article by mentioning that the counselor's role can be to help the client bring the unconscious into the consciousness. They think that offering a relaxation technique such as meditation, breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, and guided muscle relaxation could help clients in calming their distressing side. Also, compassion-focused therapy is a type of therapy that also uses mindfulness and relaxation techniques and is good to use with individuals who experience some sort of trauma in their lives, primarily through epigenetic issues. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, epigenetics causes heritable changes to occur that can have long-term effects on future generations. Epigenetics attempts to answer how life experiences might permanently alter body and brain function, and further study is needed to fully understand the effects of epigenetics on minority populations. There are many ways in which epigenetics can be addressed in counseling sessions with clients, and many strategies involve mindfulness and relaxation techniques through compassion-focused therapy and solution-focused therapy. Next slide.